So there I was, sitting in the most pretentious meeting room this side of Andromeda, and watching a collection of aliens who looked like they'd been designed by committee argue about humanity's unexpected talent for blowing things up. The Galactic Council chambers reeked of bureaucracy and whatever the Zentorian representative had for lunch, which smelled suspiciously like fermented gym socks. Admiral Vex Thule, a 7-foot-tall blue lobster in a uniform that probably cost more than my entire military pension, was waving his claws dramatically at a holographic display showing Earth's recent performance metrics in galactic conflicts. Apparently, we'd been punching way above our weight class, and it was making the established powers nervous. Esteemed colleagues. Vex Thule clicked in that pompous tone that screamed I peaked in Military Academy. These humans have demonstrated combat effectiveness that defies all logical parameters. They are primitives who still use chemical propulsion. Yet they consistently outperform species with millennia more experience. General Kriex, who looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with middle management, bobbed his triangular head in agreement. Indeed, Admiral. Their tactics are unorthodox. During the Kepler incident, they used their own supply ships as projectile weapons. Who does that? Humans do, I thought, remembering that particular engagement with fond pride. Sometimes the best missile is the one nobody expects. The question, continued a blob-like counselor, whose name I couldn't pronounce without dislocating my jaw, is how do we harness this creativity for our own forces? And there it was, the moment that would change everything. These galactic geniuses had decided that the best way to understand human military effectiveness was to hire us as instructors. They wanted to bottle our secret sauce and serve it to their own troops. Enter yours truly, Commander Jake Morrison, call sign Tank, recently retired from the Earth Marines and desperately in need of something to pay for my ex-wife's alimony. When the recruitment officer, a cheerful little green fellow who reminded me of a talking pickle, explained the job, it sounded like a dream assignment. Teach basic military tactics to alien cadets at a prestigious academy, excellent pay, full benefits, and all the exotic food I could stomach. What could go wrong? The position requires someone with extensive combat experience and proven instructional capabilities. The pickle being had explained, consulting his tablet with professional enthusiasm. You'll be working with our finest young minds at the Zephyrian Military Academy, providing them with insights into human tactical doctrine. Tactical doctrine. Right. If they only knew that half our doctrine consisted of try something stupid and see if it works, they might have reconsidered. But Admiral Vex Thule was convinced they were getting exactly what they wanted. A compliant human instructor who would share just enough knowledge to improve their forces without actually threatening their established order. The man clearly had never met a Marine. The human will follow our established curriculum, he assured the Council, providing supplementary insights within approved parameters. We maintain complete control over the educational process. Control. That was their first mistake. General Kriex nodded approvingly. Excellent. And if this Morrison proves unsuitable, we can always terminate his contract and select another human instructor. Their second mistake was thinking all humans were interchangeable. As I signed the contract in that sterile government building, surrounded by aliens who thought they'd just made the deal of the century, I couldn't help but smile. They wanted to learn about human military effectiveness? They were about to get a masterclass. The Galactic Council thought they were hiring a weapon instructor. What they actually got was something far more dangerous, a teacher who believed in his students. They just didn't know it yet. The Zephyrian Military Academy looked exactly like what you'd expect from a civilization that had never heard of form follows function. Gleaming spires twisted impossibly upward, connected by bridges that seemed to exist purely for dramatic effect, and the whole complex sparkled with that we spent way too much money on this sheen that screamed institutional pride. My first glimpse of the students told me everything I needed to know about what I was dealing with. 37 cadets from various species, all perfectly groomed, impeccably uniformed, and radiating the kind of confidence that only comes from never having been punched in the face by reality. They looked like they'd stepped out of a recruiting poster for Galactic Military Academy, where rich kids play soldier. Prince Blurp, a purple-skinned humanoid whose species apparently believed in hereditary military rank, that introduced himself with the kind of swagger that suggested he'd never met a problem Daddy's money couldn't solve. Greetings, human instructor. I am Prince Blurp of the Zephyrian Royal Navy. I assume you're aware of my family's military heritage? Oh, I was aware, all right. Aware that this kid needed a reality check that would make boot camp look like summer vacation. Then there was Twiddle, a nervous amphibian-looking being whose huge eyes darted around like he expected someone to pop out and quiz him on regulations. Poor kid looked like he'd been studying military theory since before he could walk, and had probably never made a decision that wasn't approved by committee first. The rest of the class was a similar mix of entitled nobles and overeducated theorists, all of whom had apparently learned warfare from textbooks written by people who'd never seen actual combat. Perfect. Airy. Dean Claxon, a fossilized bureaucrat who'd probably been at the academy since the building's foundation, handed me the official curriculum with ceremonial gravity. Commander Morrison, please familiarize yourself with our time-tested educational methodology. We pride ourselves on producing officers who follow proper procedure. I flipped through the manual, which read like it had been written by a committee of lawyers with severe anxiety disorders. Basic tactical theory. Approved strategic doctrines. Regulation compliance in combat scenarios. It was about as inspiring as a tax code and probably twice as deadly to anyone who actually followed it. So I announced to the class, tossing the manual onto my desk where it landed with the satisfying thud of institutional irrelevance. Who can tell me what the most important quality in a soldier is? Hands shot up immediately. These kids loved showing off their book learning. Discipline, declared Prince Blurp with royal certainty. Following orders without question, squeaked Twiddle, practically vibrating with nervous energy. Adherence to established tactical doctrine, offered a crystalline being whose voice sounded like wind chimes in a hurricane. Wrong, and spectacularly wrong. But exactly what I'd expected from a bunch of kids who'd learned warfare from PowerPoint presentations. The most important quality in a soldier, I said, walking over to the perfectly organized classroom supplies, is adaptability. And with that, I swept everything off the nearest table, sending carefully arranged materials clattering across the floor. Because the enemy didn't read your manual. The silence that followed was beautiful. You could practically hear their little academic minds grinding to a halt. Your first lesson starts now, I continued, ignoring Dean Claxon's horrified expression from the observation window. You have 15 minutes to organize your squad, gather supplies, and prepare a defensive position. The enemy is attacking from an unknown direction with unknown forces. But instructor, Prince Blurp protested, we haven't covered defensive positioning protocols yet. It's scheduled for week 4. Congratulations, Your Highness. The enemy just killed you while you were checking your schedule. What followed was the most beautiful disaster I'd witnessed since the Battle of Proxima Centauri. These kids had no idea how to function without explicit instructions. They stood around waiting for someone to tell them which regulation covered improvised defensive positions using classroom furniture. Meanwhile, I noticed something interesting. A few cadets, the ones who'd been trying to keep up with the theoretical pace, started experimenting. Twiddle, bless his nervous little heart, began stacking chairs into what might charitably be called a barricade. A few others followed his lead. Time, I called, surveying their pitiful attempts at military improvisation. Analysis. What did you learn? More silence. Then, tentatively, Twiddle raised a webbed hand. That real situations don't wait for proper preparation. Gold star for the amphibian. Anyone else? The enemy doesn't follow our timeline, offered another cadet, a feathered creature who looked like an accountant's fever dream. 2 for 2. And the most important lesson? Prince Blurp, looking like someone had just explained that money couldn't actually solve everything, raised his hand slowly. That we don't know how to think without someone telling us what to think. And there it was. The moment I knew these kids might actually have potential after all. Welcome to Human Military Philosophy 101, I announced with a grin that probably looked far too predatory for their comfort. The class dismissed. Tomorrow we'll discuss why the mess hall is actually your most important battlefield. As they filed out, chattering nervously among themselves, I caught Dean Claxon's expression through the observation window. He looked like a man watching his perfectly organized world beginning to crack at the edges. Perfect. Nainua. By week 3, I'd thrown the official curriculum so far out the window that it probably achieved orbital velocity. The Academy's carefully structured educational philosophy had been replaced by what I liked to call learning through controlled chaos, and the results were starting to show. Take yesterday's philosophy and strategic thinking session. According to the official syllabus, we should have been covering classical battle formation theory. Instead, I'd presented the class with the trolley problem. Except the trolley was a supply convoy, and the people on the tracks were enemy soldiers versus civilian refugees. There is no correct answer in the manual, Twiddle had said, staring at the hypothetical scenario with those huge, thoughtful eyes. How do we know what to do? That's the point, kid. Sometimes there is no manual. Sometimes you have to make the call and live with the consequences. Prince Blurp, who'd initially approached every problem by asking what would my father do, was starting to ask better questions. But how do you decide? What framework do you use when there's no established protocol? You use your judgment. You weigh the options. You consider the mission, your resources, and your responsibilities. Then you make the best decision you can with the information you have. But what if you're wrong? This from Zix, a nervous insectoid who'd spent his entire life following other people's decisions. Then you're wrong. You learn from it, and you make better decisions next time. The important thing is that you're thinking, not just following orders. This was apparently revolutionary thinking in their military culture. The idea that junior officers might exercise independent judgment had never occurred to their educational system. They'd been trained to be very expensive, very educated automatons. So I changed that. History and creative problem-solving became my favorite class to teach. Instead of memorizing famous battles, we analyzed military disasters and figured out what the losing commanders could have done differently with the resources they actually had. The Battle of Kelvin Ridge, I began pulling up a holographic display of one of their classic military defeats. 40,000 troops, perfect position, superior firepower. They lost to a force 1/3 their size. Anyone want to guess why? Insufficient intelligence gathering? Suggested Twiddle, who was becoming surprisingly good at this analytical thinking business. Close. They had plenty of intelligence. They just ignored anything that didn't fit their preconceived battle plan. The enemy did something unexpected, and instead of adapting, they kept following their original strategy right into a defeat that military historians still study as an example of institutional inflexibility. So what should they have done? Asked Prince Blurp, who'd started taking actual notes instead of just waiting for someone to tell him the answer. Good question. Let's workshop it. You're the commanding officer. Your carefully planned assault just got turned into a cluster of epic proportions. Your communications are jammed, your left flank is collapsing, and the enemy is doing something your training never covered. What's your first move? The discussions that followed these scenarios were beautiful. These kids, who'd been taught that there was always a correct answer if you just knew the right regulation, were learning to think on their feet. Physical training became adaptive tactical improvisation. Instead of the Academy's traditional obstacle courses, which had been designed to test adherence to proper form, I created scenarios that required creative problem-solving under pressure. Your squad is trapped in a building. The exits are blocked, your communications are down, and the enemy has you surrounded, I'd announce, watching 37 alien faces try to process this information. You have whatever's in this room in 15 minutes before they breach your position. Go! The first few times they panicked, but as the weeks went on, they started getting creative. Twiddle discovered he could use his natural swimming abilities to navigate flooded areas that would stop other species. Prince Blurp learned that his royal education had actually given him excellent negotiation skills that could be weaponized. Zix turned out to have an incredible talent for jury-rigging communications equipment. Most importantly, they were learning to trust their own judgment and work as a team without waiting for orders from above. The breakthrough moment came during a particularly challenging scenario. I presented them with a hostage situation, limited resources, and conflicting objectives. Instead of looking to me for the right answer, they'd formed a planning committee, assigned roles based on individual strengths, and developed 3 different contingency plans. Instructor Morrison, Prince Blurp had said after they'd presented their solution, "I believe we understand now why humans are effective in combat. It's not that you're stronger or better equipped. It's that you're comfortable with uncertainty." Elaborate. Most military training teaches you to eliminate uncertainty through better planning and superior force. But humans seem to thrive in uncertain situations. You use uncertainty as a weapon. Smart kid. And why is that effective? Because, Twiddle chimed in, his nervous energy now channeled into analytical excitement. If you're comfortable with chaos and your enemy isn't, you have a significant tactical advantage. They were getting it. Finally understanding that the greatest weapon in any arsenal isn't the biggest gun or the most advanced technology. It's the ability to think your way out of problems that no one saw coming. Unfortunately, their understanding was starting to attract attention from people who weren't nearly as enthusiastic about independent thinking as I was. The first sign of trouble came in the form of Assistant Vice Deputy Administrator Kloop, a species whose evolutionary tree had apparently branched toward maximum bureaucratic efficiency. Kloop looked like someone had designed a filing cabinet with legs and given it anxiety issues. "Commander Morrison," he announced, clutching a tablet to his chest like a security blanket, "there have been some concerns raised about your teaching methodology." We were standing outside the Academy's main administrative building, where I'd been summoned for what they'd politely called an informal progress review. In my experience, any meeting described as informal was about as informal as a court-martial. "What kind of concerns, Administrator?" "Well," Kloop consulted his tablet nervously, "several instructors have reported that students in your program have been asking questions. Questions are generally considered a good sign in educational settings. Not these kinds of questions. They've been asking instructors to justify lesson plans. They've been suggesting alternative approaches to established procedures. Yesterday, a cadet asked Professor Vlix why the Academy teaches 16 different ways to request permission to engage the enemy but 0 ways to make that decision independently. I tried very hard not to smile. And this is a problem because it disrupts the established educational framework. These students are supposed to be learning proper military protocol, not developing personal opinions about strategic doctrine." There it was. The real issue wasn't that the students weren't learning. It was that they were learning to think for themselves, which was apparently not part of the curriculum. "Administrator Kloop, may I ask what you think the purpose of military education should be?" The question seemed to physically pain him. "To produce officers who will follow orders efficiently and implement established tactical doctrines according to regulation." "And how's that working out for you? Historically speaking?" More tablet consulting. More nervous fidgeting. "I'm not sure I understand your question." "Your military has lost its last 4 major engagements, despite having superior numbers, better equipment, and more thorough planning. Your officers follow regulations perfectly right up until the moment the enemy does something unexpected, at which point they freeze up because nobody told them what regulation covers that situation. But the regulations exist for a reason. They represent centuries of accumulated military wisdom. They represent centuries of accumulated military mistakes that you're determined to keep repeating. You want to know why humans are effective. It's because we assume the plan will go wrong and we train people to handle that reality." This conversation was apparently being overheard by people with more authority than Kloop, because within the hour I found myself sitting across from Admiral Vex Thule and General Kree X in the kind of intimidating conference room that governments use when they want you to feel small and compliant. "Commander Morrison," Admiral Vex Thule began, his claws clicking against the polished table surface, "we've been reviewing reports of your teaching activities. And, Tokernuts, they raise certain concerns about your adherence to approved educational protocols." General Kree who'd been silent up to this point, leaned forward with the kind of expression that suggested he'd been looking forward to this conversation. Your students have been exhibiting behaviors that suggest they're questioning fundamental military principles, such as asking why orders exist instead of simply following them, such as suggesting modifications to time-tested tactical approaches, such as demonstrating initiative that exceeds appropriate parameters for their rank and experience level. I looked at these two specimens of military leadership, both of whom had clearly spent their entire careers climbing bureaucratic ladders without ever getting their hands dirty with actual combat, and felt a familiar surge of Marine Corps irritation. Let me get this straight. You're concerned because the students are learning to think? We're concerned because they're learning to think incorrectly, Vexthul replied. Military effectiveness depends on discipline, hierarchy, and adherence to proven methods. Your proven methods have proven exactly one thing: they don't work against enemies who adapt. Our methods have maintained galactic stability for over 3 centuries. Your methods have maintained a status quo that's been slowly decaying for 3 centuries. You've been winning battles against enemies who use the same outdated tactics you do. But put your forces against anyone who actually innovates, and you fold like a house of cards. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that precedes either diplomatic breakthroughs or wars. Unfortunately, I was dealing with bureaucrats, so I was betting on the war. Commander Morrison, General Creek said finally, we appreciate your perspective, but we feel it may be time to return to more traditional instructional approaches. You mean you want me to stop teaching them to think and go back to teaching them to follow orders? We want you to teach them to follow the right orders. And who decides what the right orders are? Another meaningful look passed between the two senior officers, people with more experience and better judgment than cadets fresh out of basic training. People like you? People like us. There it was. The real issue wasn't educational philosophy or military effectiveness. It was about control. These two had spent their careers in a system where thinking was done at the top and implementation was done at the bottom, and the idea of educated junior officers making independent decisions threatened that entire power structure. I'll consider your recommendations, I said, which was technically true. I'd consider them briefly before ignoring them completely. As I left the meeting, I couldn't help but smile. They were worried about a few students asking questions. Wait until they saw what those students could do when they really started thinking for themselves. The routine military exercise was announced with all the fanfare of a galactic celebration. According to the official briefing, it would showcase the Academy's training effectiveness by pitting student units against seasoned professionals in a carefully controlled environment. What it actually was, anyone with half a brain could see, was an elaborate setup designed to humiliate my students and justify returning to traditional teaching methods. They'd even brought in observers from the Galactic Council to witness what they clearly expected to be a spectacular failure. The exercise scenario was a classic: defend a strategic position against superior forces with limited resources. The kind of textbook situation that had a textbook solution, assuming you followed textbook tactics against textbook enemies. My students were assigned the defensive position, a supply depot on the edge of a simulated colony world. Their opposition was the Academy's demonstration team, composed of senior instructors and professional soldiers who'd been drilling these exact scenarios for years. The official observers, including Admiral Vexthul and General Creek, settled into their elevated command post with the satisfied expressions of people about to watch a predetermined outcome unfold exactly as planned. Attention all units, came the announcement over the exercise communications network. Scenario Alpha 77 will commence in 10 minutes. Defending forces will demonstrate proper defensive protocols. Attacking forces will implement standard assault procedures. Exercise parameters are locked and loaded. I watched from my assigned observation point as my students received their briefing. According to the scenario, they had 48 hours to prepare their defenses before the attack began. Their equipment allowance was deliberately limited, their supply lines were intentionally vulnerable, and their communications were restricted to short range only. It was designed to be an impossible situation that would force them to fall back on established defensive doctrine, which would then be systematically dismantled by an attacking force that knew exactly what that doctrine would be. There was just one problem with this brilliant plan. My students didn't follow established doctrine anymore. Prince Blurp, who'd been elected as the unit commander through a democratic process that would have horrified his royal parents, gathered his team for what the observers probably expected to be a standard tactical briefing. Instead, what they got was something unprecedented in galactic military history, a planning session where junior officers were encouraged to contribute ideas. "Okay, people," Blurp announced, "we've got a classic impossible scenario. Limited resources, predictable attack vectors, and an enemy that knows our playbook better than we do. Suggestions?" "Well," said Twiddle, who'd become surprisingly confident in these discussions, "the scenario assumes we'll try to hold the depot itself. But what if we don't?" "Elaborate." "The mission objective is to prevent the enemy from capturing strategic supplies. It doesn't actually require us to defend the depot building. What if we move the supplies?" Zix, the nervous insectoid who'd turned into a logistics wizard, pulled up the supply inventory on his tablet. "Most of this stuff is portable. Food, medical supplies, small arms ammunition. We could redistribute it." "To where?" asked another cadet. "Everywhere," said Twiddle, getting excited. "Cache it throughout the area. Make them hunt for it instead of just walking in and taking it." I watched Admiral Vex Thul's expression shift from smug confidence to mild concern as the students continued their planning session. This wasn't following the script. Over the next 48 hours, the students implemented what could charitably be called the most unorthodox defensive strategy in Academy history. Instead of fortifying the depot, they scattered the supplies across dozens of hidden locations. Instead of preparing static defensive positions, they organized mobile harassment teams. Instead of centralizing their command structure, they established autonomous cells that could operate independently. Most brilliantly, they used the exercise's communication restrictions against the attacking force. Since their radios were limited to short range, they developed a system of physical signals and dead drops that the attackers couldn't intercept. When the assault began, the demonstration team advanced on the depot, expecting to encounter prepared defensive positions and concentrated resistance. Instead, they found an empty building and a note that read, "Thanks for stopping by. The supplies are around here somewhere. Good luck finding them. P.S. You might want to check your own supply lines." That's when things got really interesting. The students had realized that the exercise parameters worked both ways. If their communications were restricted, so were the attackers. If the scenario limited their resources, it also limited their opponents. And if the attacking force was following standard assault doctrine, they were predictable. While the demonstration team was busy conquering an empty depot, student teams were systematically dismantling their supply chain, jamming their communications, and generally turning their carefully planned assault into a logistical nightmare. "This is irregular," Admiral Vex Thul declared, standing up in the observation post as reports started flooding in about the chaos developing across the exercise area. "The students aren't following proper defensive procedures." "No," I replied, not bothering to hide my satisfaction. "They're not. They're winning." By the end of day 2, the situation had become completely inverted. The attackers, who were supposed to be overwhelming a fixed defensive position, but were scattered across the countryside hunting for hidden supply caches while being systematically picked apart by mobile student teams who treated the entire exercise as a giant game of hide and seek with weapons. The final blow came when Prince Blurp's team infiltrated the attacker's command post during a shift change and left another note, "Your tactical doctrine is showing. I might want to cover that up." When the exercise officially ended, the demonstration team had captured the depot building and approximately 15% of the supplies. The students had successfully preserved 85% of their strategic resources while inflicting casualties at a ratio that would have been considered impossible under B. Traditional tactical analysis. Unacceptable. General Krieks was practically vibrating with bureaucratic outrage. This exercise was designed to test adherence to proper military protocol. "And it did," I replied. It tested whether blind adherence to protocol was more effective than adaptive thinking and creative problem-solving. The results speak for themselves. Admiral Vex Thule looked like someone had just explained that gravity was actually optional. But they completely ignored established defensive doctrine. Yes, they did. And they won. Decisively. Against opponents who knew that doctrine better than they did, and had every advantage except one. Which was none. They learned to think for themselves. As the observers filed out, arguing loudly about proper procedures and regulatory compliance, I noticed my students gathered in a celebratory huddle, analyzing their performance with the kind of detailed tactical discussion that would have made Sun Tzu proud. They'd just proven that the deadliest weapon in any military's arsenal isn't technology or firepower. It's soldiers who can think. The question now was what the Galactic Council was going to do about it. The graduation ceremony was supposed to be a celebration of traditional military excellence, complete with speeches about honor, duty, and adherence to time-tested principles. Instead, it turned into the most awkward institutional reckoning in galactic history. The ceremony was held in the Academy's Grand Amphitheater, with representatives from across the galaxy gathered to witness the latest class of young officers receive their commissions. Admiral Vex Thule and General Kriek sat in the places of honor, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else in the universe. Dean Claxon approached the podium with the expression of someone about to perform surgery on himself. Distinguished guests, he began, today we celebrate the graduation of Academy Class 2387, a class that has distinguished itself through unconventional achievement. That was probably the most diplomatic way to describe completely revolutionized military education through systematic rejection of established doctrine. Before we proceed with the traditional ceremony, I believe Admiral Vex Thule has an announcement. The Admiral rose slowly, like a man walking to his own execution. After extensive review of recent training outcomes, he said, each word clearly causing him physical pain, the Galactic Council has reached several important conclusions about military education. The audience leaned forward expectantly. This should be good. Noun. First, we have determined that the training methodology implemented by Commander Morrison has produced measurably superior results in practical combat assessment. Polite applause. That was bureaucrat speak for the humans' crazy ideas actually work. Second, we have decided to implement expanded educational flexibility across all military academies, allowing for more adaptive approaches to tactical instruction. More applause, slightly less polite. Translation. We're copying his methods before someone else does. Third, we are pleased to announce that Commander Morrison has accepted a permanent position as Director of Innovative Military Education, with a mandate to develop new training programs throughout the galactic military system. The applause this time was genuine, at least from the students and younger faculty members. The older administrators looked like they were attending a funeral, specifically the funeral of everything they'd believed about military education. I stood up to acknowledge the announcement, catching sight of my students in the front row. Prince Blurp was grinning like someone who'd just discovered that rebellion was not only possible but profitable. Twiddle was practically bouncing with excitement, his natural anxiety finally channeled into something positive. Even Zix looked confident, which was probably the first time in his life he'd felt that way about anything. Thank you, Admiral, I said, stepping to the podium. I'd like to say a few words about this graduating class. The amphitheater fell silent. Even the administrative staff stopped fidgeting. When I arrived at this academy, I was told my job was to teach these students how to follow orders. But here's what I actually taught them: how to think for themselves, how to adapt to changing situations, and how to take responsibility for their decisions. I looked out at the audience, making eye contact with the various military officials who'd spent the past months trying to stuff the educational genie back into its bottle. Some of you are concerned about what it means to have officers who question orders and modify tactics based on their judgment. You're worried about discipline, hierarchy, and maintaining proper military structure. Nods from the old guard. They were still hoping this was heading toward reassurance about traditional values. Those are legitimate concerns, I continued, but they're based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what military discipline actually means. Discipline isn't blind obedience. It's the ability to make the right decision under pressure, even when no one is telling you what that decision should be. More uncomfortable shifting from the administrators. These students have learned that real military effectiveness comes from understanding the mission, assessing the situation, and taking appropriate action regardless of whether it matches what the manual says. They've learned to be soldiers, not just uniformed bureaucrats. Prince Blurp stood up suddenly, followed immediately by the rest of the graduating class. They were applauding, but more than that, they were standing at attention in a way that had nothing to do with regulations and everything to do with respect. "The galaxy is changing," I said, raising my voice over the applause. "New threats are emerging that won't be defeated by following old playbooks. The military that adapts fastest will survive. The military that clings to outdated doctrine will become a historical footnote." I looked directly at Admiral Vex Thule, who was staring at me with the expression of someone watching his worldview crumble in real time. These officers are ready for that future. They know how to think, how to adapt, and how to lead. Most importantly, they know that the greatest weapon any military can possess isn't advanced technology or overwhelming firepower. It's soldiers who can solve problems no one has seen before. The applause was thunderous now, coming not just from the students but from younger faculty members, junior officers in the audience, and even some of the supposedly conservative military observers. After the ceremony, as the newly commissioned officers celebrated with their families, Admiral Vex Thule approached me with the careful manner of someone trying to make peace with a force of nature. "Commander Morrison," he said, "I admit that your methods have produced unexpected results." "Better results," I corrected. "Yes, better results. I wanted to ask, in your new position, will you be maintaining the same educational approach?" I smiled, thinking about all the other military academies across the galaxy that were about to discover what happened when you taught soldiers to think instead of just follow orders. "Admiral, I'm just getting started. You wanted to know the secret of human military effectiveness? You're about to find out what happens when you unleash that secret across the entire galaxy." He looked terrified. Good. Change should be a little terrifying, especially for people who'd spent their careers avoiding it. As I watched my first class of graduates head off to their new assignments, I couldn't help but feel proud. They were carrying something more dangerous than any weapon into the galaxy's military establishment, the radical idea that thinking was not just acceptable but essential. The Galactic Council had wanted to harness human military effectiveness. They'd succeeded beyond their wildest nightmares. They'd created an entire generation of officers who understood that the deadliest weapon in any arsenal wasn't a gun or a bomb. It was a soldier with a functioning brain and the confidence to use it. Aim over bureaucrats. Class dismissed.